"I never imagined mercy could look like this," whispered Liesel Bauer as she crouched among the rubble, her fingers brushing against broken bricks and dust that coated the remnants of her family's bakery. The spring air carried a strange warmth, heavy with the scent of wet earth and sun-bleached wood. She shifted, feeling the stiffness in her knees, the ache in her back, every muscle protesting the weight of exhaustion and hunger. Across the square, the American Jeep rolled to a halt, kicking up a cloud of fine dust that shimmered in the late afternoon light. Sergeant William Hayes stepped out, tall and steady, his boots crunching softly on the debris-strewn ground. His eyes scanned the ruined village, landing finally on Liesel. She froze, her pale blue eyes wide, heart pounding, unsure whether to shrink further into the shadows or move toward the stranger who might represent hope or danger. Hayes knelt slightly, tilting his head in a gesture of calm, reaching into his pack to produce a small ration bar, wrapped and unassuming. Liesel hesitated, suspicion etched into every line of her face, the years of propaganda whispering caution in her ears. She watched as he broke a piece for himself first, chewing slowly, deliberately, showing no haste, no hidden intent, only the ordinary act of eating. The sun caught his hair, a warm glow highlighting the gentle curves of his expression, the quiet patience in his movements. Liesel's hands, trembling, lifted toward the offering, and then withdrew, then reached again, each motion a silent conversation between fear and hope. Dust swirled in the sunlight, and for a moment the world seemed to pause, the distant echoes of artillery replaced by the soft rustle of leaves, the faint scent of distant flowers carried on the wind. Hayes gestured toward the small water canteen at his side, his eyes holding hers, unspoken reassurance flowing through the gesture. Slowly, carefully, Liesel extended her hand, the ration bar passing between them, the weight of survival, trust, and an unexpected kindness all suspended in that single transfer. She raised it to her mouth, tasting sweetness she hadn't known in weeks, her body responding to nourishment with a shiver, a small gasp escaping past her lips. Hayes watched, quietly, letting her reclaim a fragment of dignity in this broken place, the shadows stretching longer as the day edged toward evening. The light softened, illuminating the cracked walls, the scattered tiles, the remnants of a life that seemed impossibly distant. And in that fleeting, fragile moment, the beginnings of understanding passed between them, a silent acknowledgement that humanity could persist, that care could cross the boundaries of language, of uniform, of former enmity. The next morning, the sunlight crept slowly over the remnants of the village, painting the rubble with a pale gold hue that seemed almost too gentle for the devastation around it. Liesel Bauer stirred on the wooden floorboards of the makeshift shelter, her body still stiff from the previous day, yet carrying a faint trace of hope in the small act of having been fed. She rose carefully, eyes scanning the horizon where smoke lingered faintly in the distance, remnants of what had been homes and shops. Her hands brushed over a cracked windowsill, tracing the lines of shattered glass, and for a moment, she allowed herself a breath, shallow but deliberate, feeling the warmth of the sun against her skin. Outside, Sergeant William Hayes was already at work, inspecting a supply crate that had arrived the night before, his movements methodical, almost ritualistic, as though each step in the process reminded him that order could exist even in chaos. He glanced up and caught her watching, offering a nod, subtle yet grounding, signaling that the fragile connection forged yesterday remained unbroken. Liesel took a cautious step forward, her feet crunching over debris, and Hayes moved slightly to clear a path, his presence solid, steady, a quiet reassurance amid uncertainty. The air smelled faintly of baked bread from a nearby temporary kitchen, mingling with the dust and the sweet undertone of spring blossoms struggling to emerge from the ruined gardens. Liesel hesitated near the edge of the square, observing other displaced villagers beginning to stir, their movements slow and uncertain, reflecting the heavy weight of loss and exhaustion. Hayes gestured toward a small makeshift water station, the movement deliberate and calm, inviting without command. Liesel approached, the sun warming her shoulders, and took a cup of cool water, the liquid soothing, grounding her in a world that suddenly seemed less hostile. The small act of drinking became a ritual, A moment of reclaiming control over her body and senses, a simple act that reminded her that survival could also carry dignity. Hayes watched quietly, giving her the space she needed occasionally. Checking the surrounding area, ensuring the environment was safe, his eyes alert but gentle. Liesel turned slightly, her gaze tracing the uneven cobblestones and broken tiles, imagining the paths they once created, paths now overrun with debris, yet still offering a sense of continuity, of movement forward. Hayes broke the silence with a soft inquiry, his voice measured, asking if she could manage to walk to the nearby aid station, offering assistance if needed. Liesel nodded, hesitant but willing, and Hayes extended a hand, which she took lightly, the contact brief yet grounding, a bridge across language and fear. They walked slowly together, the weight of the past heavy yet shared in this small motion, step by step, the rhythm of their movement echoing faintly in the empty streets. As they approached the aid station, other villagers began to take notice, observing the interaction with a mixture of curiosity and relief, the sight of care and attentiveness contrasting sharply with the devastation around them. Hayes guided Liesel inside, showing her where food rations and clean blankets had been arranged, his gestures clear, patient, allowing her to comprehend and choose without pressure. Liesel hesitated at first, then selected a modest portion of bread and cheese, the simplicity of the meal striking in its generosity. Hayes waited nearby, hands at his sides, eyes soft but attentive, giving her the space to eat and process, the quiet patience emphasizing the dignity in these small acts. Outside, sunlight continued to shift, shadows lengthening, highlighting the uneven surfaces of the ruined buildings and the fragile greenery beginning to reclaim spaces once lost. Liesel took her first bite slowly, savoring the texture and flavor, her body responding to nourishment with subtle relief and renewed strength. Hayes observed, noting her cautious movements, and offered gentle encouragement through a nod or slight smile, reinforcing the sense that trust could be rebuilt incrementally, gesture by gesture. The surrounding air was alive with quiet sounds, distant water flowing from a broken pipe, the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional call of a bird returning to the area, small reminders that life persisted even amidst devastation. Liesel finished the portion, her posture relaxing slightly, shoulders easing the tension accumulated over months of uncertainty. Hayes assisted in arranging the remaining rations, guiding her toward a quiet corner where she could rest if needed, each movement deliberate, reinforcing the consistent thread of care. She glanced at him briefly, a silent acknowledgement passing between them, a mutual understanding that these shared moments, small as they were, represented the beginning of something fragile yet enduring, a bridge across the uncertainty of the world around them, a testament to patience, human kindness, and the quiet strength of trust being rebuilt one careful step at a time. The afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the remnants of the village, and Liesel Bauer moved carefully, her steps deliberate as she followed Sergeant William Hayes toward a small cluster of tents where supplies were being organized. Each step raised tiny clouds of dust, the particles catching the sunlight like scattered gold, and she noticed how the world seemed both immense and fragile, the devastation around her tempered by the gentle persistence of life. Hayes led her past overturned carts and fragments of roof tiles, his hand occasionally gesturing to a patch of ground where clean blankets had been laid for villagers who had nowhere else to rest. Liesel paused to examine the arrangement, her fingers brushing over the folded fabrics, feeling the rough texture against her fingertips, a stark contrast to the harshness of the ruined streets outside. Hayes watched her quietly, giving her space to absorb the scene, the subtle rhythm of his breath a grounding presence beside her. They approached a tent where a small group of local volunteers were distributing simple meals, slices of bread, portions of cheese, and small pieces of fruit. Hayes motioned toward the line with a soft word of guidance, ensuring she understood that she could take what she needed without hesitation. Liesel nodded slightly, the corners of her mouth tugging into a faint smile as she accepted a modest portion, the act of holding food in her hands filling her with a small but profound sense of security. She found a quiet spot nearby, settling on a broken wooden crate, and began to eat slowly, her movements careful, measured, each bite a meditation on the relief and sustenance it brought. Hayes remained at a respectful distance, eyes alert but kind, observing her without intrusion, allowing her to reclaim some agency in the midst of uncertainty. Around them, the village seemed to breathe in tandem with their movements. A distant breeze rustled through the fragmented trees, carrying the faint scent of fresh grass and sun-warmed soil. Liesel lifted her gaze occasionally, noting the patches of blue sky peeking through the clouds and the gentle sway of the few remaining blossoms, reminders that the world was not wholly consumed by loss. Hayes spoke softly at one point, mentioning where the next supply point was located and offering assistance if needed, his tone calm, reassuring, devoid of any urgency or command, giving her the freedom to make her own decisions. She rose slowly, carrying her small meal with care, and followed him as he guided her toward a narrow path leading to another section of the village, the steps synchronized in an unspoken cadence that conveyed safety and attentiveness. Along the way, Liesel noticed small signs of resilience. A sapling growing through cracked cobblestone, a bird perched atop a fractured fence post, the distant sound of flowing water from a nearby stream. Each detail seemed amplified in significance, a reminder that persistence and recovery could exist even in the smallest elements of the environment. Hayes paused occasionally, pointing out clean water stations, areas designated for rest, and minor repairs being undertaken by volunteers, his gestures deliberate and patient, ensuring she could navigate without difficulty. Liesel absorbed these instructions, committing each landmark to memory, the awareness providing a measure of comfort and predictability in a setting that had been largely unpredictable. As they reached the edge of the tent cluster, the sun dipped lower, softening the shadows, and Liesel felt a cautious optimism, a quiet acknowledgement that small acts of care and organization could reshape the environment from one of despair into one of possibility. Hayes offered a gentle nod, a silent affirmation of her progress and understanding, and Liesel returned it with the faintest of smiles, the first visible trace of calm determination in days. The village, though scarred and incomplete, seemed to shift subtly under the interplay of sunlight, movement, and human presence, a fragile promise of continuity and renewal that they both recognized in the shared rhythm of their steps, in the careful, deliberate attention to the details that could sustain life, dignity, and trust even amidst the echoes of the past. The evening sky shifted to a soft amber, the remnants of daylight brushing the broken rooftops and scattered bricks with a tender glow, and Liesel Bauer walked slowly beside Sergeant William Hayes, each step a careful negotiation between balance and the unfamiliar terrain. The village had begun to settle into a rhythm, small movements and tasks giving shape to the otherwise scattered environment, and the two of them moved with it, observing the subtle ways in which life persisted even after disruption. Hayes pointed toward a narrow lane where a small group of displaced villagers were tending a patch of sprouting vegetables, their hands dirty but movements purposeful, cultivating sustenance from the scarred soil. Liesel paused, watching the tender green shoots sway gently in the breeze, the faint scent of fresh earth mingling with the warmth of the late sun, and a sense of quiet awe touched her, the resilience of life stark against the backdrop of destruction. Hayes remained beside her, silent and steady, his presence a grounding influence, the gentle cadence of his breathing and the soft scrape of his boots on uneven stone providing an unspoken reassurance. Liesel moved closer to the garden patch, observing the careful work, noticing the way the soil gave under the villagers' fingers, the rhythm of planting and watering creating a pattern both deliberate and soothing. Hayes knelt briefly beside her, showing her a method of checking the soil, demonstrating the gentle pressure needed to assess moisture without disturbing the fragile seedlings, and Liesel imitated him carefully, the action grounding her in purpose beyond survival. As she worked, she noticed the subtle interplay of sunlight and shadow across the village, the way the buildings, though broken, cast familiar shapes and lines, and how the golden light softened the rough textures, lending the scene a quiet dignity. Hayes spoke softly, pointing out which areas needed extra care, using simple language and clear gestures, allowing her to absorb the instructions without feeling rushed or overwhelmed. Liesel nodded, her movements measured, internalizing each step, and a faint smile emerged, the first sign of trust translating into action, her body remembering structure and routine in a world recently chaotic. They moved on from the garden patch, stepping over fractured stones and scattered debris, Hayes guiding her to a small water source, the cool liquid flowing steadily, clear and refreshing, offering both practical relief and symbolic reassurance of stability. Liesel knelt to fill a small container, feeling the temperature of the water against her hands, and Hayes stood nearby, his posture relaxed but attentive, eyes scanning the surroundings, ensuring that the environment remained safe and orderly. The village seemed to respond in subtle ways, birds returning to the edges of the open space, a faint rustle of leaves, a soft whistle of wind through fractured structures, each sound layering with the next to create a sense of continuity and hope. Hayes gestured to a nearby makeshift table, where clean utensils and simple food were laid out, encouraging Liesel to take a small rest, emphasizing through motion and glance the importance of pause and reflection. She complied, setting down her container and sitting briefly, savoring the simplicity of the moment, tasting air and light, appreciating warmth and nourishment, and Hayes remained at a respectful distance, providing a steady, unobtrusive presence. Liesel allowed herself to breathe deeply, noticing the subtle textures of her surroundings, the coolness of stone under her fingertips, the warmth of the sun on her back, the faint scent of earth and vegetation mingling, the muted sounds of activity blending into a rhythm that felt steady and human. Hayes broke the silence at intervals, offering guidance and quiet observations, his voice measured and calm, reinforcing trust without pressure, allowing Liesel to navigate her environment safely and with growing confidence. As the sun continued to lower, casting longer shadows, Liesel felt a cautious sense of grounding, her body moving more fluidly, her mind appreciating the order emerging from chaos. And in these shared, unspoken moments, the first traces of collaboration and mutual understanding began to take hold, the simple acts of care, instruction, and attentive presence forming a bridge across the distance and uncertainty of the world they had inherited. The sun had fully settled toward the horizon, casting a deep amber glow across the village square, and Liesel Bauer lingered near the small stream where the water trickled over smooth stones, her fingers lightly touching the surface as if testing its presence against the certainty of her own senses. Sergeant William Hayes stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed but alert, scanning the area with a careful eye, the soft rustle of his uniform a reminder that he was close yet not imposing. Liesel bent to take a small sip, the cool water soothing her parched throat and bringing a clarity to her thoughts that had been dulled by days of uncertainty and weariness. Around them, the village exhaled in quiet rhythms, the faint movement of leaves in the evening breeze, the distant hum of activity from a nearby aid station, and the soft calls of birds returning to their perches creating a tapestry of sound that grounded Liesel in the present moment. Hayes gestured toward a collection of makeshift benches set beneath the shadow of partially standing walls, and she followed, carrying her container carefully, mindful of each step across uneven ground. They sat side by side, the gap between them measured, respectful, and yet intimate in its simplicity, the proximity allowing for a shared awareness of the surrounding environment without the need for words. Hayes reached into his bag and retrieved a small, folded map, pointing to locations where additional supplies had been arranged, his finger tracing lines slowly, deliberately, ensuring she could comprehend the layout and retain the information for herself. Liesel followed the movement with her eyes, nodding subtly, the act of observing and internalizing giving her a renewed sense of agency and control. As they continued, a soft breeze carried the scent of freshly tilled soil from a nearby garden, mingling with the warmth of the sun still lingering on the debris, a combination that brought a faint sense of normalcy and promise amid the disruption. Hayes spoke at intervals, his voice low, measured, providing gentle guidance on where the paths were safer and which areas offered the most reliable sources of water and shade, each instruction layered with patience and attentiveness. Liesel absorbed every detail, her body responding to the rhythm of walking, the steadiness of Hayes nearby, and the tactile sensation of holding her small container. each element reinforcing a growing sense of stability and trust. They moved together through narrow alleys where the sunlight dappled the ground, illuminating fragments of broken rooftops and scattered tiles, the interplay of light and shadow lending a cinematic texture to the ruins and the emerging signs of life. Hayes paused to point out a small cluster of flowering plants growing through cracks in the pavement, their resilience a quiet testament to the persistence of life even in the most unexpected places. Liesel bent slightly, brushing her fingers over the petals, the soft texture surprising against the harshness of the environment, and Hayes observed her reaction with a quiet understanding, allowing the moment to unfold without interruption. The movement of the village continued around them, children cautiously returning to the edges of cleared spaces, the faint laughter and chatter creating a background of human presence that was both tentative and comforting. Hayes guided her toward a slightly elevated area where supplies and resting spots had been arranged with careful thought, emphasizing through gesture the importance of pacing herself, of taking moments to rest and observe, not merely to move or perform tasks. Liesel followed, feeling a growing sense of rhythm in their progress, a connection not only to Hayes but to the environment itself, the textures, sounds, and light guiding her steps as much as his careful attention. The evening light softened further, shadows stretching long across broken cobblestones and fractured walls, creating a palette of amber and gray that seemed to highlight the contrast between devastation and emerging hope. And in this shared awareness, Liesel felt a quiet understanding forming, a recognition that the careful, deliberate actions of one person could shape not only her experience, but the subtle rebirth of the space around them. Hayes offered a small nod, a silent acknowledgement of her attentiveness and growing confidence, and Liesel returned it, the gesture carrying weight beyond words, an unspoken agreement that in these fragile, deliberate moments, trust, patience, and human connection could restore a sense of order and dignity to a world still finding its balance. The late afternoon light had begun to soften, casting a warm amber glow over the remnants of the village, and Liesel Bauer followed Sergeant William Hayes as he guided her toward a small cleared area where the remaining structures had been arranged into functional spaces for rest and temporary shelter. The ground was uneven, littered with fragments of tile and stone, yet each step was measured and deliberate, Liesel attuning her movements to the rhythm of her companion, sensing his presence as both protection and guidance. Hayes gestured toward a group of clean blankets and water containers, explaining through simple phrases and patient gestures which areas were available for use and how to approach each task safely, his voice low, calm, and unobtrusive, offering reassurance without pressure. Liesel nodded, absorbing the instructions, her body moving with increasing confidence, the weight of her previous exhaustion eased by the careful, structured guidance. Around them, the village hummed softly with activity. A volunteer adjusting a tarp over a makeshift shelter, children cautiously exploring cleared pathways, the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze, and the distant murmur of water from a stream beyond the buildings. Each sound and movement seemed to reinforce the sense of emerging order, a fragile but tangible rhythm that contrasted with the silence and uncertainty of the days before. Liesel approached a small area where vegetables had been planted, the shoots tender and green against the brown soil, and she knelt to examine them, brushing her fingers lightly over the earth, feeling both its texture and its potential for life. Hayes crouched beside her, demonstrating the careful handling of the fragile plants, his movements slow, deliberate, emphasizing respect for the growth and the environment. Liesel mirrored him carefully, her actions precise, the tactile engagement with the soil bringing a sense of grounding and purpose. The sunlight continued to shift, highlighting cracks in the walls and broken roof lines, illuminating the subtle resilience of life in the small sprouts, the returning birds, and the faint greenery pushing through rubble. Hayes pointed toward a distant tent where additional supplies were stored, using gestures and clear, unhurried words to guide her, allowing Liesel to navigate with autonomy while maintaining a connection to his support. She rose, carrying a small container of water, her hands steady now, her movements more confident, and followed him along narrow paths between fractured structures, each step reinforcing the emerging trust and rhythm of collaboration. Along the way, Liesel noticed the interplay of shadows and light, the warmth on her back, the scent of fresh earth mingling with the residue of the village, and she took a deep breath, feeling a subtle shift in perception, a growing awareness that care and attentiveness could coexist with uncertainty. Hayes offered occasional guidance, his gestures minimal yet precise, providing reassurance through presence rather than force, allowing her to make decisions and move with a measure of independence. They reached a small cluster of tables where simple meals were laid out, and Hayes encouraged her to rest and eat, demonstrating patience and attentiveness, letting her dictate the pace, creating a space for comfort and quiet reflection. Liesel sat carefully, savoring the textures and flavors of the food, noting the warmth in her hands, the faint aroma rising from the simple meal, the act of eating becoming a quiet assertion of agency and dignity. Hayes remained close, attentive, yet unobtrusive, offering support through measured presence, allowing the environment and her actions to communicate safety and trust. The village seemed to respond subtly to their movements, leaves rustling gently, sunlight shifting across uneven ground, distant voices blending into a muted rhythm that reinforced the sense of stability. Liesel looked toward Hayes briefly, acknowledging his careful attention and guidance with a soft nod, an unspoken agreement forming between them that each deliberate act of care, observation, and patience could shape not only her immediate experience, but the broader sense of order and renewal in the space around them. The light continued to fade, shadows lengthening, yet the golden hues offered a sense of continuity, a reminder that even in the aftermath of disruption, resilience, attentiveness, and human connection could quietly re-establish stability and hope. And in this shared, deliberate rhythm of movement, observation, and support, Liesel felt a growing confidence and calm that had been absent in the days prior. A subtle but profound understanding that small, measured actions could sustain life, dignity, and trust in ways that words alone could not convey. The evening settled into a soft, muted light, the sky painted with gentle hues of orange and pink as Liesel Bauer followed Sergeant William Hayes along a narrow path that wound through the fractured remains of the village. Each step was measured, her feet careful on the uneven stones and scattered debris, and Hayes walked beside her, his presence steady, a silent reassurance amid the quiet uncertainty of the fading day. The air carried the faint scent of earth and blossoming vegetation, mingling with the warm undertone of sun-baked wood and dust, creating a sensory tapestry that reminded Liesel of the world beyond destruction. Hayes paused briefly to indicate a small cluster of improvised shelters where volunteers were organizing supplies, gesturing to show the safest route without intrusion, and Liesel observed intently, absorbing each movement and instruction. She noticed how the tents had been arranged thoughtfully, blankets and food distributed with care, and the way small details, like a clean water container placed beside a resting area, communicated consideration beyond words. The path led them to a modest garden patch where young plants were growing through the soil, tender and green against the brown of the cleared earth, and Liesel knelt to examine the delicate shoots, her hands brushing lightly over the leaves, sensing life persistently emerging despite the surrounding ruin. Hayes crouched beside her, showing her how to assess the soil and the water levels, his movements slow, precise, and patient, allowing her to follow without pressure, fostering understanding through demonstration, rather than instruction. The light continued to shift, casting long, gentle shadows across the village square, highlighting the contrast between broken structures and the subtle vitality of new growth. Birds returning to perch on fractured walls, their calls a soft harmony that layered over the faint murmur of human activity. Liesel took note of each sound, each movement, internalizing the rhythms of the space, her senses becoming attuned to the interplay of environment and human presence, her steps now guided by awareness rather than uncertainty. Hayes gestured toward a simple arrangement of food and resting areas, encouraging her to pause and take a moment for herself, emphasizing through posture and expression the importance of self-care amid recovery. Liesel settled carefully on a low stone, the warmth of the remaining sunlight providing comfort as she sampled a small portion of bread and fruit, savoring texture and taste with deliberate attention, each bite a reinforcement of her ability to sustain herself and regain strength. Hayes observed quietly, offering a grounding presence, moving subtly to adjust a blanket or ensure water was within reach, his actions measured and unobtrusive, reinforcing trust and safety. Around them, the village began to exhale with the rhythm of life returning, the subtle sounds of footsteps, conversations, and the distant flow of water blending into a soft background, providing a sense of continuity and reassurance. Liesel lifted her gaze to the horizon, noting how the remaining structures caught the last light, the interplay of color and shadow creating a visual narrative of resilience and care, and she felt a quiet confidence building, a sense that small, consistent acts of attentiveness and human connection could re-establish order and hope. Hayes offered a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of her observation and understanding, and Liesel returned it with a subtle shift of her shoulders and a soft exhale, the unspoken agreement of shared effort and mutual respect carrying weight beyond words, a delicate thread binding them to the rhythms of recovery and the quiet promise of stability within the fragile yet persistent life of the village. The following morning arrived with a delicate light, soft and filtered through the thin clouds lingering above the village, casting muted gold upon the fractured buildings and uneven streets, and Liesel Bauer stepped carefully along a narrow path, each movement deliberate as she followed Sergeant William Hayes through the slowly awakening settlement. The air carried the faint scent of tilled earth and fresh water from the nearby stream, mingling with the residual warmth of the sun, and Liesel noticed how the subtle textures and smells seemed to anchor her in the present, easing the lingering tension from days of uncertainty. Hayes moved with measured attentiveness, guiding her toward a cluster of small tents where additional supplies had been arranged, his gestures clear but unobtrusive, allowing her to take in the environment and assess it with her own judgment. She observed the orderly placement of blankets and containers, the careful arrangement of simple meals, and the way light caught the edges of makeshift tables, revealing patterns of care and thoughtfulness in the organization of the space. As they walked, Liesel noticed the faint green shoots pushing through cracked stone near a partially standing wall, their persistence a quiet testament to resilience, and she bent slightly, brushing her fingers over the tender leaves, appreciating the contrast of life emerging amidst ruin. Hayes crouched beside her, demonstrating how to assess soil moisture and check for stability in the small garden plots, his movements deliberate, patient, and measured, providing guidance without intrusion, allowing Liesel to internalize each step and gain confidence in her understanding. The village around them exhaled softly with life. Birds returned to perches on broken rooftops, the distant rustle of leaves blended with the muted hum of human activity, and the flowing water of the stream created a steady undercurrent of sound, reinforcing a sense of continuity and normalcy. Liesel carried a small water container carefully, moving toward a shaded area Hayes had indicated as a resting spot, and she settled with awareness, observing how sunlight fell across the uneven surfaces, casting long, gentle shadows that highlighted both destruction and the subtle beauty of recovery. Hayes remained nearby, his presence steady and reassuring, occasionally pointing toward points of interest with a soft gesture, explaining without urgency where supplies could be accessed, areas for rest, and tasks that could be undertaken safely. Liesel absorbed the instructions, noting each detail and moving with a growing sense of confidence, her body responding to the rhythm of guidance and observation, her awareness attuned to both the environment and the supportive presence of Hayes. They paused at a small table where provisions had been arranged for the morning, and Hayes indicated she could take a brief moment to rest and eat, emphasizing through posture and expression that self-care was important in maintaining both energy and focus. Liesel sat, appreciating the texture of the bread, the coolness of the water, the subtle aroma rising from simple, freshly prepared items, allowing herself to take in nourishment with deliberate care, and Hayes watched attentively, giving her the space to internalize the comfort while maintaining quiet assurance. The village seemed to shift in rhythm with their movements. Leaves whispered in the gentle breeze, distant voices mingled with the steady hum of activity, and the interplay of sunlight and shadow over the broken structures created a sense of depth and continuity, suggesting stability amidst the fragile reconstruction. Liesel glanced toward Hayes, offering a slight nod, which he returned with a subtle, reassuring smile, the shared understanding of attention and care resonating in the quiet connection between them. Each measured step, each observation, each deliberate pause reinforced a growing sense of order and trust, a recognition that patience, attentiveness, and human connection could create stability and dignity in the midst of disruption. And in this soft, attentive rhythm of morning, Liesel felt a strengthening of confidence, an unspoken affirmation that small, consistent acts of care and guidance could sustain life and nurture hope in ways that words alone could not convey. The afternoon air carried a gentle warmth, soft against Liesel Bauer's skin as she walked beside Sergeant William Hayes through a small pathway lined with the remnants of buildings and scattered debris, each step deliberate, measured, and mindful of the uneven ground beneath their feet. The village had begun to settle into a quiet rhythm, subtle movements of life weaving through the spaces between the broken structures. A volunteer arranging supplies, a few children cautiously exploring cleared areas, and the faint sound of water flowing from a nearby stream providing a steady, grounding cadence. Hayes moved with careful attentiveness, indicating the path to a partially cleared square where temporary tables had been set up with meals and blankets, his gestures gentle and precise, allowing Liesel to follow and absorb the arrangement with her own understanding. She paused to observe the details, noting how the sunlight struck the edges of the broken walls and scattered tiles, casting long, delicate shadows and illuminating small bursts of greenery that had begun to reclaim space among the ruins. The interplay of light and shadow created a texture both stark and beautiful, offering a visual contrast that mirrored the gradual restoration of order within the village. Hayes crouched to adjust a container of water, ensuring it was easily accessible, and Liesel mirrored his movements instinctively, noticing the subtle care in each action and recognizing the quiet intention behind them. She bent slightly to examine a patch of young plants, brushing her fingers lightly over the fragile leaves, feeling the subtle resistance of the soil beneath, and Hayes remained beside her, demonstrating patience and attentiveness, his hands guiding her movements without interrupting her autonomy. The surrounding village seemed to respond in kind. Birds returned to perch on fractured rooftops, the soft rustle of leaves accompanied distant footsteps, and the occasional murmur of conversation from nearby residents formed a gentle, continuous background that reinforced a sense of safety and connection. Liesel carried her small water container with careful attention, her movements increasingly confident, and followed Hayes toward a shaded area where blankets and simple provisions were arranged to allow rest and reflection. She sat gently, the warmth of the sun still lingering on the uneven surfaces around her, and tasted a small portion of bread and fruit, each bite deliberate, bringing both nourishment and a subtle reassurance of stability. Hayes observed quietly, offering presence rather than words, providing a grounding influence that allowed her to absorb the scene, the light, the air, and the care embedded in the arrangement of supplies. As they sat, the shifting sunlight highlighted cracks and edges in the remaining walls, emphasizing textures that spoke of persistence and human ingenuity, and Liesel felt a faint sense of rhythm emerging, an understanding that measured attention, patience, and thoughtful action could reshape even fractured spaces into areas of order and dignity. Hayes gestured softly toward the edge of the square, indicating the next steps in exploring and organizing resources, using deliberate motions that allowed Liesel to interpret and follow at her own pace. She rose, stepping carefully over broken stones, her movements fluid, guided by observation and the subtle cues of his attentive presence, the rhythm of their steps forming a shared cadence that reinforced trust and awareness. Around them, the village exhaled gently, the sound of flowing water, rustling leaves, and distant human activity blending into a comforting tapestry of life, and Liesel noticed the way light reflected across the uneven surfaces, illuminating small details, a sprouting flower, a patch of clean ground, a carefully arranged blanket, that marked the progress of recovery. Hayes offered a subtle nod, a silent acknowledgement of her attentiveness and growing confidence, and Liesel returned it, sensing an unspoken bond forming, a quiet understanding that deliberate care, patience, and presence could restore stability and a sense of safety to both the environment and the people moving through it. Each measured action, each attentive observation, each deliberate pause contributed to a slowly emerging sense of order, dignity, and mutual respect, and in the soft glow of afternoon light, Liesel felt a strengthening awareness that these small, consistent gestures of care and attentiveness were building a foundation of trust, resilience, and quiet hope within the fragile yet persistent life of the village. The late afternoon light shifted toward a soft golden hue, casting long, delicate shadows across the village square as Liesel Bauer walked beside Sergeant William Hayes, each step measured and deliberate over the uneven terrain, her feet carefully navigating fragments of tile and stone that still marked the remnants of what had once been homes. The air was thick with the faint scent of freshly turned earth and water from the nearby stream, mingling with the warmth of the lingering sunlight, creating a sense of presence that grounded her in the moment. Hayes moved with quiet attentiveness, guiding her toward a slightly elevated section of the village where makeshift tables and blankets had been arranged, each detail reflecting the careful planning and consideration of those restoring order amidst the ruins. He gestured softly toward water containers and areas designated for rest, allowing her to observe and understand the layout on her own, fostering a sense of autonomy while maintaining a protective presence. Liesel paused to examine the small garden plots, the young green shoots rising resiliently through the brown soil, and she knelt to brush her fingers lightly over the delicate leaves, feeling the texture of life persistently emerging in the aftermath of disruption. Hayes crouched beside her, demonstrating the careful way to assess soil moisture and stability, his movements slow and deliberate, emphasizing patience and attentiveness without imposing control, allowing Liesel to internalize the lesson through observation and gentle guidance. The village around them exhaled in subtle rhythms, birds returning to perch on partially standing walls, leaves rustling in a soft breeze, the faint murmur of distant conversations and activity blending into a steady backdrop of human presence. Liesel carried her water container with careful attention, following Hayes toward a shaded area where blankets and simple provisions were available for rest, her body moving with a growing fluidity and confidence, guided by both observation and the subtle cues of his careful presence. She sat down, the sunlight catching on the uneven surfaces around her, and took a small portion of bread and fruit, savoring each bite deliberately, allowing the act of nourishment to reinforce a quiet sense of stability and agency. Hayes remained nearby, his presence steady and unobtrusive, observing and occasionally adjusting the arrangement of supplies, providing reassurance through silent attentiveness rather than words. The shifting sunlight illuminated cracks and edges in the structures around them, highlighting textures that spoke to persistence and human care, and Liesel felt a subtle rhythm emerging, a sense that measured observation and deliberate action could create order and dignity within the disrupted environment. Hayes indicated with a gentle motion the next point of interest, encouraging her to move at her own pace and explore additional areas for water and rest, emphasizing through gesture the importance of autonomy balanced with guidance. Liesel rose, stepping carefully over scattered debris, and followed him along narrow paths between fractured walls, noting the subtle interplay of light and shadow, the warmth on her back, the faint aroma of earth and greenery, each detail reinforcing her growing awareness and confidence. The village seemed to respond to their deliberate movements, the soft sounds of water, rustling leaves, and distant human activity blending into a steady, comforting rhythm, while Hayes provided gentle, measured cues to reinforce her understanding of the space and the ongoing work being done. Liesel lifted her gaze to observe the remaining structures and small patches of vegetation reclaiming the terrain, noticing how even minor gestures of care and attention, arranged blankets, accessible water, organized supplies, could reshape the environment into a space of stability and trust. Hayes offered a brief nod, a silent acknowledgement of her attentiveness and developing confidence, and Liesel returned it with a subtle exhale, the quiet exchange of understanding underscoring the growing sense of collaboration, patience, and human connection. Each step, each observation, each deliberate pause reinforced the sense that trust, order, and hope could be rebuilt incrementally. And in the fading light, Liesel sensed the persistent possibility that careful attention, thoughtfulness, and shared presence could nurture both resilience and dignity in ways that extended far beyond the immediate moment, shaping a fragile but enduring foundation for recovery within the village. The evening descended softly over the village, the sky painted in muted shades of purple and gold as Liesel Bauer walked alongside Sergeant William Hayes through the narrow paths that wound between fractured walls and scattered debris. Each step was deliberate, measured, the uneven ground demanding careful attention, and Hayes remained close, his presence steady and reassuring, guiding her without words. The air was tinged with the faint scent of fresh earth and distant blossoms, mingling with the warmth of the lingering sunlight and the cool hint of approaching night, creating a sensory landscape that grounded Liesel in the moment and eased the lingering tension from earlier days. Hayes motioned gently toward a small open square where blankets and provisions had been arranged thoughtfully, allowing for movement, rest, and observation, and Liesel absorbed the scene carefully, noting the placement of clean water containers, neatly folded blankets, and simple meals laid out with attention to detail. She paused to examine a small cluster of young plants emerging through the soil, brushing her fingers lightly over the leaves, feeling the resilience of life persisting amid the broken stones and shattered tiles. Hayes crouched beside her, demonstrating the careful way to assess the soil and water content, his movements patient, deliberate, and unobtrusive, providing guidance that allowed her to internalize each step with confidence. The village around them seemed to breathe in subtle rhythms, birds returning to their perches, leaves rustling softly in the breeze, and distant voices mingling with the gentle flow of water from a nearby stream, all creating a quiet harmony that reinforced a sense of continuity and order. Liesel carried her water container carefully, stepping toward a shaded area Hayes had indicated for rest, moving with increasing fluidity, the rhythm of her steps guided by observation and the attentive cues of her companion. She settled gently on a low stone, the warmth of the fading sunlight soft against her skin, and took a small portion of bread and fruit, savoring each bite deliberately, allowing the nourishment to reinforce her sense of stability and agency. Hayes remained nearby, offering a quiet presence rather than words, his attention focused on subtle adjustments to the surrounding area, ensuring the environment remained organized and accessible, reinforcing safety and trust without intrusion. The interplay of light and shadow highlighted cracks in walls and uneven ground, illuminating textures that spoke of endurance and careful human attention, and Liesel felt a subtle shift within herself, a sense of rhythm emerging from observation, movement, and deliberate action. Hayes indicated with a soft gesture the next section of the village to explore, emphasizing autonomy in her movements while providing reassurance and guidance through careful posture and eye contact. Liesel rose, stepping carefully over scattered debris, and followed him along narrow passages, noting how the warm glow of sunset softened the edges of broken structures, the faint scent of vegetation mingling with dust and sunlight, each detail reinforcing her growing awareness and confidence. The village responded to their quiet presence, the sound of flowing water, rustling leaves, and distant human activity blending into a comforting rhythm, while Hayes provided gentle cues that emphasized attentiveness, observation, and thoughtful movement. Liesel glanced at him, offering a subtle nod, which Hayes returned with a faint, reassuring smile, the unspoken understanding between them reinforcing trust, patience, and collaboration. Each measured step, observation, and deliberate pause reinforced the sense that careful guidance, attentive observation, and consistent, small acts of care could restore stability, dignity, and quiet hope within the village. In the soft, fading light of evening, Liesel felt a growing awareness that through deliberate action, patience, and shared presence, resilience could be nurtured, trust could be rebuilt, and a fragile yet enduring sense of order and possibility could emerge, shaping both her experience and the slowly healing environment around her.